I must tell you, I went up to my room. Sally's having to work remotely from the room this week, and she joins me in the evenings. So I went up after lunch and I said, I don't know how I'm going to spend my free afternoon, but I'm just going to sit here for a minute. 2 hours and 11 minutes later, I woke up. So, so however you spent your day, I pray that it was productive. I feel that mine was. As we begin today, I want to make special acknowledgement and recognition of, and get this, friends, the 19 people, 19 of our colleagues who have signed on remotely this morning. Yeah, let them hear your applause. We had one of those in our covenant group this morning who joined us remotely. There is prayers being lifted up and a real deep desire to be connected to this body, even though we can't see them face to face. Well, we turn this morning to an opportunity to reach back in order to pivot forward. Dr. Ashley Boggan is absolutely doing amazing work to bring relevancy, perspective, and a freshness to the work of the Commission on Archives and History. I must say, in the company of this body, to Ashley, thank you personally. I feel a partnership with you in ministry. Every time I email Ashley, it's a quick response in helping me to research certain parts of our history as they relate to our Book of Discipline, and she's been enlightening and very much needed as we're trying to connect with our past. Ashley's with us today to lead us in a teaching session on the role of the episcopacy in the Methodist movement. I'm eager to hear what she has to say. I hope you are, and I pray that you'll be gracious in welcoming Dr. Ashley Boggan to lead us in our morning session. Ashley?
Good morning. Thank you, Bishop Bickerton, and thank you, Bishop O, for the invitation to speak this morning. Thank you, Bishop Harvey, for your leadership on our commission. And thank you to the council for being willing at 10:45 this morning after a long week to listen to some history. Over the next hour, we will journey through some key moments when Methodism and its episcopacy began to do a new thing. Throughout this talk, I'll argue that as Methodism was forming, leaders of the emerging institution reacted to real change and real needs of those they served there. We got to get to the good stuff, the history. So let's go back to 1812. 1812 was the first general conference since the Constitution of the Methodist Episcopal Church was written. And it's the first general conference with delegated representation. At the opening session, Bishop McHenry stood up, walked to the podium, and delivered an Episcopal address. When he finished, he turned around to see a rather astonished Bishop Asbury standing right behind him. Asbury said in a voice that I am sure that all persons could hear, "I never did business in this way, and why is this new thing introduced?" McHenry replied, "You are our father, we are your sons. You have never had need of it. I am only a brother and have need of it." Apparently, this answer satisfied Asbury, and he sat down. This new thing is the first Episcopal address to be given at the beginning of a general conference. Why this new thing? Well, we as Methodists should not shy away, and historically we have not shied away from doing new things. Francis Asbury, for all of his shock at McHenry's action, spent his life doing new things. Asbury arrived in the colonies in 1771 as a 22-year-old licensed preacher. After Thomas Coke ordained him elder according to Wesley's commands, he was to be consecrated as a general superintendent. But Asbury did a new thing. Asbury denied Wesley's direct order and his direct authority by insisting that he be elected general superintendent by the Conference of Preachers. Asbury knew how to do new things in this revolutionary era United States. And he knew that above all, persons sent from England with certain titles and certain orders would not be tolerated. If he was to have any true sense of authority, it would have to come through an election from the full representation of preachers at a conference. At the Christmas conference, not only were Asbury and Coke elected as general superintendents, but their duties were defined by the preachers themselves. Question 26, what is the office of superintendent? Answer, to ordain superintendents, elders, and deacons, to preside as a moderator in our conferences, to fix the appointments of preachers for the several circuits, and in the intervals of the conference to change, receive, or suspend preachers as necessity may require, and to receive appeals from the preachers and the people and decide them. You all might think about your offices today and notice a few things have been maintained and maybe a few have been added on. But the episcopacy wouldn't change its basic functions until the 1810s, when Bishop McHenry proposed a change to the appointment process, which sought to include presiding elders, or what we now know as district superintendents, as an advisory cabinet. While this idea was not fully implemented until 1815, it worked to distribute the powers and the duties of the episcopacy. Here you can see Bishop McHenry's plan of the circuits from 1820, and this original document is held at the Vanderbilt School of Divinity. I added a highlight so you can look at the way that McHenry was organizing and the types of columns that he's listing here. The General Conference of 1816 added one final new function for the episcopacy. Aside from electing 2 new bishops due to the death of Francis Asbury en route to General Conference, the delegation made it the duty of the bishops to devise a course of study for candidates in ministry to follow before being received into full connection. Candidates from then on had to prove that they had acquired sufficient knowledge in certain key works chosen by the bishops before being ordained. This move was historic for a few reasons. First, it shows the power of the General Conference to shape the episcopacy, and it aligned the episcopacy with the traditional function as a teacher of theology. But let's be honest, it is almost impossible for one person to do all of the things listed as the answer to question 26, yet alone to add the office of teacher to it. For example, let's look at Asbury's ministry. He was a bishop for 32 years, and in that time, he presided at 234 annual conferences. He ordained approximately 4,000 persons, and he laid hands on 7 who would become bishop. Here we have one of the treasure troves from our archives at the General Commission. It is Asbury's examination book from 1810 to 1813. He lists every single preacher and his opinion of them. You can see, I've highlighted a few. He was a man of few words, and quite poignant words, if you will. So you can see here, Alfred Griffith, useful, acceptable, afflicted, gracious. Caleb Reynolds, married, afflicted, acceptable preacher. James Smith, poor James Smith, unsteady mind, no disciplinarian, married. Now, I hope that some of you out there keep treasures like this and that you will donate them to Archives and History so that in 100 years from now, you can join Francis Asbury as part of this legacy. But with all that Asbury was doing, he didn't have time to also be a teacher and constructor of theology. He did not have the time to do this, but he had the time to live his example out, to live his theology out. His ministry was exemplary, and he lived the practical, connectional theology of Wesley. Now, John Wesley was a teacher and prolific writer. He got his love of education from his mother, Susanna, who ensured that her daughters knew how to read before they learned to sew. Wesley sought multiple degrees for his day and was known for his wit. He established schools and sought to provide multiple outlets for the orphaned, the poor, the elite, and especially his preachers to learn. For the Christmas conference, he sent along his list of approved books, sermons, commentaries, and liturgies, mostly written by himself, for what he still considered to be his movement. However, Wesley was not a bishop. And if you're not yet aware of Wesley's opinions of bishops, I offer you this nugget of history. Now, the Conference of 1787 had just refused Wesley's recommendation of Richard Watcote to join as a general superintendent, and they removed Wesley's name from their list of approved general superintendents. In other words, the Conference of 1787 of the Methodist Episcopal Church was making an intentional move to distance themselves from Wesley. After the conference dismissed, Francis Asbury, along with John Dickens and Thomas Coke, did a new thing. They revised the minutes of the conference and replaced the word superintendent with the word bishop. The use of the word bishop infuriated Wesley. He wrote on September 20th of 1788 what would be his last communication with Asbury. Known as the Dear Frankie letter, Wesley made his opinion quite clear. But in one point, my dear brother, I am a little afraid both the doctor and you differ from me. I study to be little, you study to be great. I creep, you strut along. I found a school, you a college, and you name it after yourselves. One instance of this, of your greatness, has given me great concern. How can you, how dare you, suffer yourself to be called bishop? I shudder, I startle at the very thought. Men may call me knave or a fool, a rascal, a scoundrel, and I am content. But they shall never by my consent call me bishop. For my sake, for God's sake, for Christ's sake, put a full end to this. I don't know about y'all, but whenever I read this letter, I still feel that I'm in trouble. And it's rather apparent that John Wesley was not a fan of bishops. He'd rather be called a knave, a fool, a scoundrel than be called a bishop. So y'all, what are we as inheritors of the Methodist Episcopal Church to do with this? How do we understand the opinion of our founder? Asbury made an intentional pivot away from John Wesley when he not only named himself a bishop, but formed an institution and called himself its bishop. It seems that movements can have leaders, but institutions, those need bishops. I was recently at the 100th anniversary celebration of Gulfside Assembly. At that gathering, Bishop Alfred Norris talked about institutions that shape us and included not only the United Methodist Church, but Gulfside as an entity that formed him and so many others. What particularly struck me, though, was he asked the question, which comes first, the institution or the movement? My historian mind automatically went to a nice evolutionary process of grassroots movement leading to institutions. So of course, movement begets institution. But he flipped it around and argued that out of institutions come movements. Y'all, the United Methodist Church is an institution in need of some movement. We've siloed and constrained ourselves in so much polity and in so many committees and rules that none of us know what the other one is doing. So how do we move amongst each other in this? How do we revive the connectionalism amongst us? How do we give the Spirit of God space to move amongst us? As Methodism developed into this institution, and as the episcopacy developed into an office, they both lost sight of the prophetic ministry of the peoples called Methodist. This did not happen overnight, but was a gradual process. It happened as bishops began to react to needs of the church and its people instead of prophesize about the future needs of the kingdom of God. Now, I'm not going to list every single small change to the episcopacy that has emerged since 1784, but I do want to highlight some of the changes and how they've affected the office. Bishops Asbury and Bishop McKendry were the last bishops to fully itinerate throughout all of the annual conferences. They were the last bishops in their time to never marry. They were the last bishops to oversee every single appointment made. Over time, the episcopacy has become more of a regional, a diocesan office that is largely administrative. And as we discuss regionalism and connectionalism as a worldwide church, we need to think about how our historic regionalization has already impacted the episcopacy. So first, one of the first major changes that shaped the episcopacy came in 1939. I would argue that the creation of the jurisdictional system was a full stop to any semblance of prophetic mission of the Methodist tradition. It was through this system that Methodism institutionally and broadly catered to white supremacy. Here, instead of prophetically shaping a church structure and an episcopal authority in a way that was forward-looking, one that would push society to be more equitable, and one that would ensure access to all resources of the denomination for all persons who called themselves Methodist, the jurisdictional system was a pure reaction to anti-Black racist mentalities of the Jim Crow era. Since its creation, bishops have been elected by jurisdictional and/or central conferences, and again are further limited in their itineracy to these regions. Another major shift we see when we track the episcopacy is a change in who is elected. Between 1784 and 1845, which is also the period of our greatest growth in membership. Only 14 persons were elected to the episcopacy. 6 of the first 9 bishops were presiding elders, what we now know as district superintendents. This makes sense. They were the ones who would have been most well known throughout the connection. After the split into the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South, the role of presiding elder declined, and the connectional office arose. Between 1845 and 1939, 93 persons were elected to the episcopacy. Those elected normally held appointments outside of the local church. 5 were publishing agents, 15 were missionary secretaries, 12 held other connectional offices, and 22 were editors of various church papers. But during this almost 100 years, the most common setting for successful candidates in both branches of Episcopal Methodism was higher education. More bishops were elected from the seminaries during this time than anywhere else and at any other point in our history. It seems that the 1816 assignment of that teaching office to the episcopacy was truly lived into during this period. Bishops elected were responsible for organizing the connectional nature of the church, but not the connectional nature in the sense of its structure, the connectional nature in a sense of its theological function. They were the ones who shaped the theology in the 2 branches of Methodism, through periodicals, through establishing seminaries, and through conference positions. And this was one of the few times that bishops took a primary role in shaping the theology and how clergy were trained. After 1939, there was another new process for electing bishops, the jurisdictional system. Bishops no longer had to have national or international recognition in order to be elected by the General Conference. They simply had to be known well enough in their annual conference and maybe a few surrounding conferences. This drastically affected who was elected. Between 1939 and 1968, 109 persons are elected to the episcopacy. Of these, only 13 were serving boards and agencies. 7 were editors of church publications, and only 1 was a district superintendent. The rest were large church pastors. The impact of this meant that the office was no longer one directing and constructing in a theologically informed connection, but was someone who had shown that they were a good administrator, a not too controversial person, a pleasing preacher, and somewhat of a celebrity in their local area. The process again changed in 1968 to include persons now running for bishop. Politics fully entered the episcopacy as persons began to align with certain caucus groups, travel to key conferences and make key sermons, or are given key positions to hold for a few years so they can get their name out there. And y'all, since 1968, 246 persons have been elected to the episcopacy. District superintendents and other key conference positions have regained prominence as a stepping stone. But again, these limit the itinerant and connectional piece of those seeking the episcopal office. And today, more persons are still elected directly from being big church pastors. Today, we have an opportunity to think about what the episcopacy should look like in the future. It's time that we take a theological look at the role of bishop. And as Methodists, how do we examine our theology? We go directly to our history. As historian Russell Ritchie argues, Methodist theology is embedded in our practicality. Wesleyan theology was found in how Wesley acted, how he loved, how he transgressed the norms of his day. Wesleyan theology was the brilliance of his class, his band, and society system, which proactively responded to drastic social change and social need of the 18th century. And it still spoke volumes as Methodism expanded across the United States and across the globe. It worked to bring people together who, without Methodism, had few connections to self, to community, and to God. Wesley's genius was in his ability to take his vision and adapt it and mold it time and time and time again for the ever-changing needs of the people he served. He was constantly proactive and missionally prophetic. This is what we've lost. We've tied ourselves up in polity and constrained systems and racist structures to where even if we want to be missionally prophetic, we can't. Our visions have to go through committee and committee and conference, and if they do pass, perhaps the moment to be prophetic has passed too. So how do we untangle ourselves back to a movement? And how do we do this not because of that big scary dis word that I'm not going to say, but to do it because it's 2023 and we are a worldwide church that needs to wake up a little bit. We are a church that needs to listen to its past to envision its future. And y'all, 2023 is not that different from Wesley's day. Many of the people in the 18th century were nuns and duns. They were tired of the institutional church because it did not meet their everyday needs, and it refused to change in order to do so. People were expected to pay taxes to support the local church, but they didn't see the local church supporting their basic needs. The national landscape of England was broken up into parishes, and for centuries, the parish system had functioned reasonably well. However, all of this came to an end with the Industrial Revolution. Transitioning from rural farming to pastoral economies, millions of people abandoned their homes and their long-held family lands in search of what they thought would be lucrative industrial jobs. As a result, mass migrations exploded across England and then on to the North American colonies. The parish system quickly collapsed under all of this stress, and millions of these migrants suffered without support systems. This is where Methodism came in. It provided critical opportunities for not only evangelism, but to expand care and fulfill the basic need that was no longer being met by the system. Methodists filled in the gaps through care of the poor and disenfranchised, through establishments of schools and hospitals. And from the very beginning, the itinerant commission of Methodists demanded that we go to the collapsed places where people are in most need. Our world today looks a lot like Bristol, England, in the 1730s. Bristol was a seaport town, and in Wesley's day, it was the major port for the Atlantic slave trade. Bristol was the second largest city in England behind London. It was the birthplace of this industrial revolution. It produced everything from soap to chocolate to cannons. And it was surrounded by coal mines. And it was massively overcrowded. While its medieval walls were designed to hold 5,000, the Industrial Revolution had swelled its populace to 40,000. It lacked a basic sanitation system, and it was widely known as the dirtiest town in all of England. It also maintained a massive divide between the rich and the poor. Wesley is called to Bristol in late March of 1738 by his longtime frenemy, George Whitefield. Now, Whitefield had been in the city for a while, preaching to ever-increasing crowds, and he calls on John to assist him. John arrives on March 31st and was astounded to find Whitefield preaching to thousands in the fields. 1 year later, John wrote in his journal, "I could scarcely reconcile myself at first to this strange way of preaching in the fields." Now, up until this point, John had followed the preaching standards of his day. I had been all my life, till very lately, so tenacious of every point relating to decency and order that I thought it was a sin to save souls not inside a church. By April 2nd, 2 days after his arrival in Bristol, he does something he thought he never would. At 4 p.m, I submitted to be more vile and proclaimed in the highways the glad tidings of salvation, speaking from a little eminence in an adjoining the city to about 3,000 people. Now, fellow Methodist historian Ted Campbell recently analyzed various primary sources of John Wesley's and concludes that John's preaching in the fields, his submitting to be more vile, was not an in-the-moment movement of the Spirit, but it was an intentional, well-thought-out vocational choice to be more vile. And Campbell points out and reminds us that it's not simply Wesley's preaching in the fields that broke the rules. More poignantly, it's Wesley's preaching within another diocese, one that was not his own. This act directly and openly violated church law. It was transgressive, yet prophetic. Vile. Now, y'all who know me are probably rolling your eyes right now, but I truly believe that we have something to learn from Wesley's submission to be more vile. I recently spoke to a group of clergy persons in the Tennessee Western Kentucky Annual Conference. Afterwards, I received an email from the pastor of Grace United Methodist Church in Jackson, Tennessee. In a Palm Sunday sermon, Reverend Mary Beth Eberly called the action of Jesus entering Jerusalem on a donkey as vile and related it to what we as Wesleyans are called to do in this world. The young adults who listened were so inspired by this idea of Wesleyan vitality that they made a shirt for their upcoming mission. Vile, it's 4 o'clock somewhere. Y'all, dare I say it, if we want to be vital again, if we want to reach people, young people, in new ways, if we want to pivot and reclaim, revive, and renew our Wesleyan mission in this world, perhaps we need to submit to be more vile. Within 3 days of being in Bristol, Wesley's entire framework of how to preach, where to preach, and what is proper versus what is missionally prophetic was wholly overthrown. This experience shook his foundational understanding of normativity, of acceptability, and replaced them with a desire to follow the Spirit of God and meet the people where they were. And because of this, my colleague and friend David Worthington, who serves as the director of John Wesley's New Room in Bristol, brilliantly states that while John Wesley's heart may have been strangely warmed in London, it was set afire in Bristol. What sets your heart afire today? After Bristol, Wesley developed a new ecclesiology for the people called Methodist. They were going to do church differently. But how? Around 1745, John Wesley wrote a treatise entitled Advice to the People called Methodist. It was emailed to you all earlier this week, and I invite you all to read through it later. But I think that these 5 pieces of advice that he offers are incredibly important to us today. They might work well in a conversation of how do we shape the episcopacy? How do we partner with the agencies? How do we become prophetic again in order to better serve the people called Methodist? Now, for context, Wesley was trying to piece together a unified missional movement in the midst of mass chaos as to who was Methodist and who wasn't. Sound familiar? He began this treatise with an acknowledgement that there were many people who were identifying as Methodist, but weren't necessarily aligning with his understanding of faith acted out through love. So he's writing to those Methodists who, quote, profess to pursue holiness of heart and life. And over the next few pages, he advises these people of 5 things. And bishops, take these to heart. 1, you are a new people. 2, do not imagine that you can avoid giving offense. 3, trust God with your all and then go on in the power of God's might. 4, keep in your path and be true to your principles. And 5, not to talk much of what you suffer. How might the continuing United Methodist Church take John Wesley's advice from 1745 and apply it towards our own future? Well, we could be a new people. We have a wonderful, interesting, historic opportunity before us to proclaim ourselves as new. In our past splits and mergers, it seems clear that we rarely took advantage of moments such as this to really figure out who we are and to boldly and proudly proclaim our identity, our mission, and our space in this world. Think back to the dozens of splinters and schism experienced in the first 50 years of the Methodist Episcopal Church. When the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, the Methodist Protestants, the Wesleyan Methodists, I could go on and on. When so many chose to leave the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church didn't change. It refused to be prophetic out of fear of losing more members. It refused to be prophetic out of fear of losing more members. We have before us now a moment to be prophetic, to rethink who we want to be in the future. We have a chance to be proactive, to be vile. The question is, are we brave enough to do it? And this is where Wesley's second piece of advice comes in quite handy. We have to remember to not be afraid to offend people. John Wesley and those at Oxford were given many monikers for their weird way of doing religion. They were called Bible moths, sacramentarians, the Holy Club. But the name that stuck with them the longest was Methodist. And we need to remember that we cease to be Methodist when we forget that our name was at first an insult. Not everyone is going to like what we are or what we are doing, and we have to be willing to make people uncomfortable, to open ourselves up to critique, because the love of God compels us to be weird, to experiment, to do things that others wouldn't, and to love people who others say aren't worthy of it. John Wesley was disparaged in his day. People who joined the Methodist movement were disowned from their families. They were seen as an absurd, ridiculous group. They didn't gamble, they didn't drink, they didn't attend the theater, and they walked around talking about universal salvation. They visited the sick and the imprisoned. They prayed incessantly. They mixed genders in secret meeting rooms. They critiqued slavery. All of this was quite offensive to the majority of people in England. But good Lord, what an example they were. And this isn't unique to Methodist history. When we think about the history of Christianity across this world, the most revered people were often the most offensive. Going back to Jesus himself, he was crucified for inclusion and love of all, an act that was seen as seditious. The early Christians who continued his message were persecuted, imprisoned, and martyred because they were too different. They tried to stir things up a little too much. Their message was just too equitable for some to hear. How can the continuing United Methodist Church reclaim this type of prophetic offense? How can we dare to spread the love of God and God's love in such ways that just irks people to their core? What if we were to elect persons to the episcopacy who dared to do ministry differently? Persons who were known not for their administration, but for their willingness to get in good trouble. What stances should we take publicly that will get people talking about us, even protesting us? And y'all, when it comes to prophetic offense, I'm often drawn to the words of Mary Bosanquet. She's one of the first female preachers of Wesley's movement, and of her own preaching, she wrote, quote, "I am conscious how ridiculous I must appear in the eyes of many for so doing. Therefore, if some persons consider me an impudent woman and represent me as such, I cannot blame them. Besides, I do nothing but what Mr. Wesley approves of. And as to reproach thrown by some on me, what have I to do with it but quietly go forward saying, I will still be more vile if my Lord requires it." Amen. Now, going back to Wesley's advice, his third and fourth points really go hand in hand and work well with these words of Mary. The Lord does not ask us to do anything that we cannot do because God is always with us and anything is possible with God. All of this struggle, strife, and ridicule will be worth it because in the end, we will be living a life of inward and outward holiness. And finally, Wesley advises his people to not complain, to not suffer openly about their ridicule, and to not condemn those who critique them. Good Lord, could we use this message? What this denomination is experiencing right now is not easy, nor should it be. We should all take a moment to grieve, as Bishop Bickerton reminded us in his presidential address on Monday. But we also need to intentionally pivot and let ourselves dream, hope, prophesize, and change the conversation. So let's do just that. Now, in this concluding section, I'm going to lay out some simple observations that I, as a laywoman, a millennial, a professor, a historian, a single mother, and a wholehearted, dedicated, vile United Methodist, that I hope will get some conversation going. I hope we can think about how can we do this new thing as a United Methodist Church. I'm going to pose two key questions that in a bit we're going to answer in small groups. These are, how do we rethink connectionalism for a virtual, asynchronous world? And the second, how do we as leaders of the church loosen our institutionalism in order that we may embrace a movement of Wesleyan vitality? Now, Wesley was able to conceive of connectionalism in a world that was turned upside down by the Industrial Revolution and massive immigration. He developed new ways of bringing together old and scattered ideas. Our ability to innovate discipleship is at the core of what it means to be Wesleyan. This past weekend, I was visiting with my sister, and we were talking about going to church, as all preachers' kids do. She mentioned that she and her family just don't feel connected to church anymore. This is a perpetual problem of preachers' kids, because no one preaches as good as mama and daddy, but it's also just a fact that the physical act of going to church on a Sunday morning doesn't always align with the needs of people. Her kids are 13 and 10. She's constantly driving them from one sport to another, one activity to another. And she and her husband both work full-time. The only time they get to do anything fun as a family is on Sunday morning. During the pandemic, when the churches were closed, they got into the habit of spending Sunday mornings on their ski boat on the Greers Ferry Lake in Arkansas, enjoying the beauty of God's creation. My younger nephew even eventually named their boat Better Than Church. But not going to church on Sunday does not mean that my sister and her family are not deeply rooted in Wesleyan values and that their Methodist faith isn't developing. My sister is one of many, including myself, who's looking for new ways to do church. And y'all, Wesley was not reaching persons sitting in the pews on Sunday morning. He was reaching people, connecting with them, and connecting them to each other and to God where they were, which was outside of the church on Sunday mornings. This is what we need to remember. And with the pandemic and the massive developments in technology, we've all been forced to think about doing church differently. We've all been pushed to be more virtual and to lead more asynchronous lives. We've seen communions, baptisms, weddings, and funerals done virtually. AA meetings now gather on Zoom. Bible studies, committee meetings, all of these happen virtually. This meeting is the first Council of Bishops meeting since 2019. And Bishop Cynthia Fierro Harvey will go down in history as the only president of the Council of Bishops to never convene the council in person. She's literally a virtual president. And y'all, some of the best United Methodist messages and sermons I've heard lately haven't been on Sunday morning. They've been on TikTok. They've been on Facebook Reels. Whenever I feel that I need God in my life, I can open up an app and find Pastor Kelly, who has over 90,000 followers on TikTok. 90,000 followers on TikTok. Y'all, we got to do church differently. And the moment is now. History is now. History is not this thing in the past that we cannot use. It's a resource meant for us to pick up and use to envision tomorrow. You gathered in this room are making history actively. You are gathering together after 3 years apart. You are the bishops who served and were elected in an 8-year quadrennium. You are history makers. Our new class of bishops is one of the most diverse to be elected. And shout out to my South Central folks for truly making history by electing 3 persons on 1 ballot. Y'all, history is now. Our job here is not to set up the United Methodist Church for today or even tomorrow. It's our job to set up the United Methodist Church for 100 years from now. We are the history. We set the tone for the future. In 100 years, I don't want future generations to think, wow, in 2023, they really had a shot if only they would have taken it. How do we get them to say, oh my goodness, during a global pandemic, during disaffiliations, during warfare, climate change, economic injustice, a global racial reckoning, in the midst of all of this, those United Methodists in 2023, they sought to be new, to be different. They sought to embrace their Wesleyan roots as vile persons who compelled others towards inward and outward forms of holiness, who lived their faith through radical acts of love. Those United Methodists set the stage for us to continue to reach beyond the walls of the church and embrace those on the margins. The only way to do this is to start to ask new questions. How do we, as United Methodists, revive connectionalism and even the itineracy in a virtual world? Think about that, seriously. How do we go from circuit riders in a geographic sense to circuit riders in a virtual network sense? What if we had preachers who itinerated only in virtual church and really had a virtual bishop? How do we form virtual bands and classes at a time when people rarely have the same hour free to gather? How do we create virtual asynchronous programming that's not only interesting, but that's spiritually formational for the world? I can assure you that the general secretaries in the back room, or in the back of this room, have ideas and have probably already implemented a few of them to do just this. In this room, as Episcopal leaders and as leaders of general agencies, it is our job to be prophetic. It is our job to serve God by serving the church and the people called Methodist. To do this, we have to anticipate their needs. We cannot risk pulling an Asbury and say, we never did business this way, and why is this new thing introduced? For too long, the episcopacy has simply been reactive to change. It hasn't been forward-looking, innovative, game-changing, because we've been too tied up in the politics of it all. It's time that bishops began to ask different questions and produce new answers. It's time that the council and the general agencies partner together in programming to ensure that the relevancy of both to the foundation of our connection is understood by all. We have an opportunity, y'all, a difficult one, but a possible one, to reclaim our heritage as Wesleyans, to revive the Spirit of God working in and through us, to renew those on the inside and outside of our churches towards holiness of heart and life. How can we reclaim our mission to do church differently, revive our willingness to be ridiculed, and to do this perhaps by renewing the episcopacy? We have the opportunity to do a new thing, and we have 3 general conferences in the next 5 years to which we can live into and implement this new thing. Y'all, if we want to be vital again as the United Methodist Church, we must first be willing to do the unimaginable, to preach in the fields of virtual reality, to create new communities in an asynchronous world. We must embrace Wesley. We must dare to risk, dare to fail, dare to be ridiculed and the talk of the town. If we want to be vital again, y'all, we've got to submit to be more vile. And it's up to you all, the bishops, to lead us in this new thing. Thank you. Thank you. before we get to small groups, we did include time for questions and answers of the presentation if you all have them. If you don't, we can jump right into small group discussion. All right. All right, well then I'm going to encourage you all amongst your tables to think about the two questions that are up on the screen. And I would love if in, what time do we go until? Noon. If y'all could think through these questions and maybe continue the conversation over lunch and throughout the rest of the day. I don't know if we have time to report back, but I would love to hear some of the things that y'all come up with. So the questions before you are, how do we rethink connectionalism in this virtual asynchronous world? It's a hard one, but it's an important one. And how do we as leaders loosen our institution a little bit in order to allow for movement to enter? It doesn't have to be a movement towards Wesleyan vitality if that's not your thing, but some sort of movement of the spirit to come in and through.
For those of you online, we are creating 2 breakout rooms for you.
And we want you to jot down at each of your table what you're talking about in a similar way as we did earlier in the week and bring them up to the front at the end. We'd love to coalesce your comments and not let them just disappear in thin air. Okay? Thanks. Okay. Let's pull our conversations together. And for the first time in my life, I can say I understand. You've lost your mother and your father in the last year, a deacon and an elder. And they would be very, very proud. They would be very, very proud. You are a gift that has come our way. And I pray that we have the courage to listen to your prophecy and the wonderful way that you connect that with who we've been in order to determine who we will be. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Friends, it's lunchtime. I know there's a meeting of the general secretaries and the presidents, and there may be some other meetings taking place. Enjoy your lunchtime. We'll be back here promptly at 2 o'clock to continue our work. I am going to call on Bishop Holston to give us announcements.
Thank you, Bishop Bickerton. For the newly elected bishops, will you please stop by the COB office, the Lindbergh room, and pick up your parchments? Linda Tate can be able to be helpful to you there. And for the class of 22, I want to remind you that tonight at 6:15, you have your dinner, class dinner, at the Capitol Grill. And I think you need to see Bishop Kenethia Bingham-Sy for that information. Those are the two announcements I have.
Have a good lunch. See you back at 2 o'clock.
Also, online, we'll switch off the link and connect it again at 1:50. Have a blessed afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.